There we go. So, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Maite Tapia. I'm an associate professor at MSU, and thank you for coming to our session. So we'll hear from scholars, or rather activist scholars and practitioners, talking about some of the main themes of our research volume that is coming out this August, and is called, as you can see, A Racial Reckoning in Industrial Relations, Storytelling as Revolution from Within. And it's edited by Tamara Lee, Sheri, Davis-Faulkner, Naomi Williams, and I. And furthermore, we also have Danielle Phillips-Cunningham here with us, and Erica Smiley will join us in a minute, as they have also contributed to this volume. And so we will hear from each one of them in a moment, and they'll introduce themselves. I also want to acknowledge the cover art, which we think is terrific. It's done by Vico Alvarez, an artist and Chicago-based Tejana. So Vico is a University of Chicago graduate, and she's worked in neighborhoods across Chicago on a range of issues, including labor, education, immigration. She's also been a labor organizer with the USW and worked for the SEIU in the past. One of her latest comics, Rosita Gets Scared, tells the story of a young undocumented girl coping with her fear of deportation. And so if you want to know more about Vico's terrific art, I just put the link in the chat. And by the way, that's not the only art in our volume. We also have a piece by Cassie Pereira, the Director of Racial and Gender Justice for the Washington State Labor Council. So this already tells you a little bit about this volume, right? So it's not your typical academic volume with standard academic chapters, although it has also some of that. But what we did is we tried to bring together scholars, activists, trade unionists, and artists around the theme of IR, industrial relations, and a racial reckoning. And we did so through chapters, but also through art, through commentaries and dialogue sessions. So before I hand this over to Sheri, I wanted to take a very brief moment to talk about how this volume came about. So within the field of industrial relations, Tammy and I have this paper recently published in the ILR review that argues that our field of IR essentially has a problem. And that is, there's the dominance of white and privileged group narratives in the questions we ask, the theory that we build, the research we publish, and so forth. So in essence, we're saying it's colorblind, and it fails to recognize or address the saliency or ubiquity of anti-Blackness and other oppressive systems of white supremacy in our labor and employment contexts. So that questions that we ask about what's justice, who's justice for, is mainly seen through the lens of the dominant social identity groups. But in our literature, we felt like we didn't really have a language to deal with that until we both learned about critical race theory and intersectionality. Because as IR scholars, we're not trained in that. So in this paper, in the ILR review paper, we argued that it's important to essentially ground our work within CRTI and to therefore acknowledge and deconstruct essentially the false realities that thrive in traditional colorblind approaches. So this volume essentially came out as kind of responding to our own call for papers that uses CRTI within kind of the broader labor studies, and essentially showing how CRTI helps industrial relations theory name and acknowledge these overlapping oppressions that then disproportionately impact Black and other marginalized workers. But another important point is also that outside the field of IR, we need to realize that many scholars, and especially scholars of color, have been writing about work and race and racism and sexism, etc., for a long time. So if we look at our volume, we also wanted to bring in people who have done this, historians, sociologists, scholars from women and gender studies, etc. And then finally, of course, this volume also wants to highlight the work that's being done by activists, by unionists, and they've been doing this for a long time. So for example, as I already mentioned, we have Erica Smiley contributing, the Director of Jobs with Justice. We have Valerie Alzaga, and let me show you here some of the some of the people in there. So we have Valeria Alzaga, she's a longtime labor and migrant rights organizer. We have Javier Murillo, a former president of SEIU Local 26 in Minnesota, etc. So just to conclude, I think we believe that this volume is a powerful and much needed intervention in the field of industrial relations, and essentially that it's a necessary step towards theoretical justice or reparations, that essentially, that in a way because there's a systemic bias, conscious or unconscious, that essentially sustains oppressive hierarchies and distorts these employment realities. So Sheri, let me hand this over to you to talk a bit more about what CRTI is, given that you're very much an expert on this, much more than I am. So thank you everyone again for being here, and Sheri, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Maite, and thanks for having us here to all the LERA folk. This, for me, is a really wonderful opportunity. I do think that when you know, over the last couple of years, we've seen where major crisis requires a pivot, and we've learned how to pivot in ways that we never thought that we would. I see this as a moment where there's an opportunity for a major pivot. And after seeing the session before with these wonderful Rutgers doctoral students, I'm really feeling like this pivot is happening. And so one of the things that I wanted to start with, one, and I think intersectionality is probably one of the most well-known tenets of critical race theory. It lays out, and it's basically a blueprint for not only theory making, but also praxis. And so speaking to not only how we think about things, but how we take action, what we do. But it is important to recognize that intersectionality is kind of part of, and the work that Kimberly Crenshaw has done is part of a larger suite or collection of tenets that make up critical race theory and the founding of critical race theory. In my chapter 2 in the book, I talk specifically about some of the tenets, but not all of them, starting with the importance of counter narrative. One of the things that we always say in practice is that we start with the story, then we put it into a historical context. We identify and name what the problems are and determine how we are going to take action, and then how we're going to build power to actually repair some of the major harms that have been caused by a variety of oppressions, not specifically just to race and gender, racism and sexism, but also ableism, transphobia, you name it. And so one of the things I think is important, again, is to understand that counter narrative is meant to be able to allow us to center subjects that are not white, male, able-bodied property owners, and to recognize that when you shift the perspective, you shift the spotlight to folks who have marginalized identities. One of the things that happens is you illuminate not only the challenges that they have, but the system that is creating those challenges, that is creating the conditions that they live within. And so I do want to make sure that you understand that when we say stories, counter narrative, or what have you, this is a very important and foundational part of CRT. Moving beyond that, taking the story and putting it into the context specifically of the people that we're centering, right? So we can do a historical context, but if it is like a dominant narrative and a dominant frame context, then we lose the perspectives of the people who are centered in the story. And so one of the things that Cheryl Harris's work, in particular, Whiteness as Property, offers is a way to put the current conditions that we have, the political economy that we live within, into a context, a historical and a political context, to understand the way that land and the harm to Indigenous folks, as well as labor and the harm to Africans who were brought to this country for the purposes of their work, shape the very institutions that we live within. And so whiteness as property is very much so about historical and political context, which is an important key tenet of critical race theory. I also lift up the importance of looking to the bottom, which is Mari Matsuda's work, and specifically because it's not just enough to hear the story, but to listen to the voices and listen to people as experts in their own lives. And so one of the arguments that Mari Matsuda makes in terms of a larger blueprint for how we go about doing our work is that when we center these narratives and we listen and understand that people who have experienced and grown up generations within oppressive systems and experienced discrimination as every part of their everyday life, that they have a particular way of understanding the systems that we live within, the social structure, the culture that we live within, and that they also have a lens for the kinds of repairs that are needed in order to address the issue, which is not necessarily, it's not just an additive thing. Sometimes it is a full-on disruption. And so she argues that when you look to the bottom, some of the challenges that, people who have not had experiences of racism and sexism in a particular way, they can't imagine, what the experiences are of POCs. And unfortunately, as scholars, too many people do try to imagine what this might feel like. She argues that if you look to sit with, spend time with, immerse in, and understand the culture of these marginalized folks and how they see what's going on, that we can actually come up with the remedies that we need. And then I also want to add interest convergence, which is largely the work of Derek Bell. How important it is that when we say, we are making progress, but somehow it seems like we're not getting the thing that we said that we wanted to get. This piece of understanding the way that sometimes the elites actually align with some of the arguments that have been made by marginalized folks. A really good example of that is when all of a sudden Amazon and others were putting out Black Lives Matter statements and racial justice was the most important thing, right? That this was a moment where you might think that we're going to actually see some specific shifts in terms of how workers, and particularly workers of color, are treated within the organization. But that's not necessarily what happened. It's just a co-optation. It's just a way where, yes, we can meet a particular need that you have, but we're going to continue along the course that we were moving in. And so I speak to these particular tenets that I think are wrapped around intersectionality in a particular way, and argue that there are implications for the field, right? Like when we bring a CRT lens, when we bring that kind of approach to our work, it illuminates pathways to power and movement building. It illuminates pathways to leadership for transformation. And it also illuminates pathways to new diverse scholars and scholarship. And I see that as the thing that I feel like is happening, that it's not just a reframe, but it's a counter narrative for a reparatory justice framework that is establishing a multiracial feminist economic democracy. And that means that we are attending to what we are for versus reacting to the systems that were never built to be able to hold, support, lift, and allow folks to thrive. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Danielle to get us into some historical context understanding.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Sheri. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Phillips-Cunningham, and I am an associate professor in the Women's and Gender Studies program at Texas Women's University. And it feels so good to be in this space with my sister friends and colleagues who are doing such powerful work around labor justice and CRTI. I had the pleasure of contributing to this very powerful forthcoming volume. And so before I talk about my chapter, I would like to add to what Maite and Sheri have said by also emphasizing the importance of this volume. So when the editors, Naomi, Tammy, Sheri, and Maite asked me to write a chapter for it, I said yes without hesitation, because their project is right on time. It's exciting. because it really speaks to the moment that we are living in now and from so many different perspectives. As we know, since the pandemic and George Floyd protests, there have been more public conversations about how intersecting racial, class, and gender inequalities impact workers' lives. So as a volume that really centers critical race theory and intersectionality, it provides many pathways forward for practitioners, lawmakers, scholars, artists, and others who are truly grappling with how to address systemic inequalities that have been impacting workers' lives for centuries. I think that this volume also captures the multidimensional and intersectional ways in which particularly people of color have been and continue to engage in labor resistance, from scholar activism to art, to labor organizing within and outside of labor unions, to labor activism within racial justice movements. And so this comprehensive approach to the study of labor is important because especially women of color, labor organizing, for example, is not always captured in labor union records and archives because of the long history of racial and gender discrimination in many labor organizations, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I refer to this particular exclusion as Jane Crow unionism, or the exclusion of Black women and their interests from labor organizations, which were primarily run by white immigrant and white American men at the time. And I'm borrowing the term Jane Crow from feminist legal scholar and critical race theorist Pauli Murray, who created it to describe the specific racial discrimination towards Black women during what is known as the Jim Crow era. She experienced this on a personal level in so many ways, which is captured in the documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray. So I just want to lift up her work as well. So because Black women have often had to organize outside of most national labor organizations, my work has involved looking for the spaces and people that are not commonly associated with labor organizing to recapture those histories of women's labor resistance that isn't often discussed, and to expand public conversations about the importance of examining the racial and gender politics of labor today. So in my book, Putting Their Hands on Race, Irish Immigrant and Southern Black Domestic Workers, I trace the long history of the racial politics of women's labor organizing that continues to shape women's labor organizing today. I do that through a comparative history of Irish immigrant and Southern Black domestic workers in Northeastern cities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Without union representation, Irish immigrant and Southern Black women took matters into their own hands by challenging racial and gender ideologies and stereotypes associated with domestic labor to assert their right to living wages. And at times, their goals conflicted with one another. Irish women demanded better working conditions by asserting themselves as respectable white working class ladies, whereas Black women had the much larger task of challenging racial and gender ideologies that denied their very humanity. And so Black women have never had of just focusing on a very narrowly defined labor justice movement. They had to push for labor rights through civil rights organizations because their everyday lives were not just tied to the wages that they received, but depended on whether or not they could vote and whether or not they would be lynched or jailed when accused of talking back to their employers. So the title of my piece in the LERA volume, I'm so excited about this volume, but it is entitled, The World is Going to Get a Correct Estimate of the Negro Woman, the Early Intellectual Work of Black Women Labor Organizers. And so in this chapter, I examine how Black women took a comprehensive approach to labor resistance through their schools. And the piece centers Nanny Helen Burroughs, who was an educator and civil rights activist for most of the 20th century. And I argue in many ways she was a labor organizer. She established the National Training School for Women and Girls in Washington, D.C. in 1909 to improve the working conditions of Black women in the U.S. and across the African diaspora. And inside of her trade school, she started so many groundbreaking labor initiatives. She started the first international newspaper that centered the working conditions of Black women. She founded the first national Black women's labor organization known as the National Association of Wage Earners. And it was the first organization dedicated to attaining labor rights for domestic workers, Black domestic workers. And members of the organization included her students and women and men from a variety of occupations. On her school's campus, she also started one of the largest Black-owned cooperatives in the 1930s for her students and unemployed Black people during the Depression, and to provide healthier food options that were not available in the neighborhood surrounding the school. Burroughs was also the co-founder. She was busy, again, because she didn't have the luxury, as most Black women, of just focusing on one particular issue. She was the co-founder of a national Black women's political organization known as the National League of Republican Colored Women. This was during a time when Black people were mostly voting for Republican candidates. And so the title of the LERA piece, "The World is Going to Get a Correct Estimate of the Negro Woman," comes from a questionnaire that Burroughs created to collect national data about voter intimidation that Black women experienced on their jobs after the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was supposed to grant all women the right to vote, but as we know, it didn't. And she presented her data to Congress and the White House to urge them to create combined civil rights and labor rights legislation. So I'm looking at Burroughs' organizing and intellectual history because I think that Black women often do not get credit for their innovative and inclusive thinking that drives their grassroots organizing. And also we're living in an opportune time to build upon the foundation that Black women and other women of color organizers built decades ago. So I'll stop right there so that Smiley can jump into the conversation and talk about her newly published book and her LERA volume chapter. So is Smiley in the room? And if so, do you want to take it from here?
I don't see Smiley yet.
Yeah, I don't see Smiley yet. If it's okay.
Yeah, Naomi, do you want to go or?
I am here. I don't know if you guys can.
Yeah, I
hear me.
saw Smiley.
Yeah.
There
Oh,
you
there's
go.
Smiley.
Good, good.
Welcome, Smiley. Do you need a couple of minutes or can we go ahead and throw it to you just to kind of introduce your work that you did in the volume and talk about how it relates to the new book that you have with Sarita?
Sure. Yeah. No. We can dive right in. Hopefully, I won't be repetitive.
Do a brief intro of yourself too.
Go ahead, Smiley. It's on you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
introduce yourself and get rolling.
Okay. Great. Thank you. It's great to be among friends. I'm Erica Smiley, the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, and
Wait, is this just me?
No, I think we had a pause. That's okay.
What's that?
It paused. You were frozen for a bit.
Okay, that's not good. All right.
Executive Director of Jobs with Justice.
All right. I'm gonna turn my camera off just so in case it does that again, you'll hear me and then I'll come back. Okay, so so Erica Smiley, yes, Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, co-author of The Future We Need with Sarita Gupta. And so I guess I'm just here to speak specifically to this moment and to some degree, as Naomi shared a little bit, to kind of draw this back to what I think of as the pathway towards a multiracial democracy that our country has been on for a long time, that it is not simply a a new development, that critical race theory is not simply a new development, that centering race and gender in the fight for democracy is not like a new idea. It has actually long been the aspiration of us as a nation trying to build this, and that in that context, organizing and collective bargaining is a central pillar. And so, I'll just start by saying that our general frame really is to understand that democracy is not just a system of political practices. It involves including the majority of people included in any given situation in active decision making and active consulting and conferring. And so it is both about a government that supports its people, but it is also about the active governing, even at the smallest levels. And that in addition to that being a political practice, that's also what workers are trying to do when they organize at their work sites. They're trying to win a collective bargaining agreement, which is really just a policy for the workplace that the workers themselves, through their unions, can be involved in enforcing and implementing. And so at its best, right, like that's actually what collective bargaining has done. And, there's a reason why unions have historically been called schools for democracy. But at the same time, the way that it is practiced today is based on a framework and is based on an economy that is not, as an understatement, is not the same as what we have today. And also that is, built on systems that exploited Black people, migrant workers, women, right, throughout its history. And so, I think that one of the things that's really important for us at Jobs with Justice, and what we try to articulate in the book, is that there's a real need to expand organizing collective bargaining to meet our current situations, to not get rid of the way that we do it now, but to expand it in ways that see contract negotiations at a site of struggle for broader issues, such as with bargaining for the common good, that allow workers to not just negotiate with their seemingly direct employer, but also with the ultimate beneficiary of their labor, the ultimate profiteer. And so, being able to have contracts with your contractor or your supplier, as well as the multinational brand that's ultimately benefiting from it. And then, of course, applying the same framework to community-driven strategies, so that it's democratic participation is not just about voting once a year, but also about collectively negotiating agreements and contracts along other economic relationships, whether it's housing, it's banking, it's debt, and other economic dynamics that might exist in any given area. And so that's like our framework. But what I am talking about today is the center of it, is that we can't do any of this without centering the struggles against white supremacy and patriarchy and gender discrimination. And that when organizations and unions do this as a part of their fights, when they put it front and center as a way of centering these issues, they win. It's not just an issue of what's morally right. It's not just an issue of like defining workers as allies, but actually of seeing the need, seeing workers and the base of people as whole people, not just the strong man with the pickaxe that we might see in the pictures, but the fact that the workforce is majority women, is majority BIPOC. And in fact, these issues might be the things that motivate them most directly. And so 2 examples just to give, even from this year alone, right? So, many of us, I think our world was turned upside down at the end of March, and on April 1st, we learned that Amazon workers, both of whom in Alabama and New York, had articulated at different moments that they had been radicalized after the murder of George Floyd, radicalized by the movement for Black Lives and the company's articulation of their support, while also arresting workers who were asking for PPE. The fact that, even a report authored by Tammy and others from Michigan State noted that the predominantly Black facility in Bessemer, Alabama, had a disproportionate amount of off-duty police officers surveilling workers and keeping everyone in check. And on April 1st, the workers in Staten Island, where Chris Smalls, a Black worker who had been arrested for demanding better conditions and equipment, won their election, their independent union, the ALU, and Bessemer remains too close to call in terms of the RWDSU and Amazon committee's election. And that was a huge deal. And I think it's an important lesson because, very few people expected it. This company had put billions into keeping the union from winning, keeping the workers from being able to organize. And the fact that this was the outcome was a significant blow and a significant defeat for them. And it's important for movement leaders to realize that what the first thing that workers led with wasn't the bread and butter, just like wage issues. They didn't do the normal stumping of making sure everyone, what are the wages? How are we figuring out these fairness? Those issues are important and people want to talk about them. But the thing that mobilized the leadership of both of these unions was this notion that the shop floor, if they were going to participate in the movement for Black Lives, their movement for Black Lives was on the shop floor, was in the company, was at the plant. And that's significant. And that's something that is important for us to think about in this moment of worker upsurge and uprising. On the same day, on April 1st, on the same day around on the other side of the planet, garment workers, mostly women, almost exclusively women, even though some of the leadership of their unions in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, had been trying to target multinational brands, fast fashion brands like H&M, The Gap, some of these other companies. And what's interesting about their campaign, which we mention in our book, and we mentioned it before the victory, obviously, is that these were women who were not necessarily in the leadership of their unions. Their unions had been fighting for years to try to get many of these brands to the table around issues of wages, to try to create a floor wage across borders, and had been unsuccessful. And even when you look at the fire and safety accord in Bangladesh in 2012, certainly some companies had come around. It was kind of a worker-driven social responsibility model, but big companies, Walmart, The Gap, like they just hadn't signed on. It wasn't, American-based companies weren't signing on. And so these women, though, were basically like, they formed a committee, a cross-country caucus around what they actually felt was a more motivating issue for many of them at the moment, which was gender-based violence, and the gender-based violence that they were experiencing in their sites every single day, producing these garments, producing these clothes. And in fact, in the Justice for Jasari campaign, we saw one of the women, particularly from Tamil Nadu in South India, was murdered after being assaulted by a manager. And it was actually through this campaign, this global campaign led by caucuses of women that were part of these unions, but were not necessarily leading the primary union demands, and a set of independent organizations and independent unions as well, garment worker unions, that ultimately got these multinational brands to the table. And on April 1st, the same day that the workers at JFK8 and Amazon won their union election, these workers signed the first multinational brand bargaining agreement, the Dindigul Agreement, which I can put in the chat in a moment, that not only sets a framework around negotiations and gender-based violence, but actually sets a pathway to negotiate around other things and includes certain things that we've dreamed of just in regular traditional contracts, such as preemptive retaliation, where the burden is on, if anything happens to one of their organizers or members or stewards, the burden is actually on the employer to prove that they weren't behind it, as opposed to being on the worker to prove that harm has been done. And so, these are just yet another example of what it means to center race and patriarchy. When you do it, it is actually a strategic necessity for winning. And in fact, not doing it is almost a guarantee of our defeat. And so in this worker upsurge, when we are paying attention, and I guess what the press often terms as the Great Resignation, and people are leaving their jobs and they're leaving bad jobs for good jobs, or maybe leaving 3 jobs so that they just have to work 1, God forbid, and they're demanding better wages. I like to liken it back to what W.B. Du Bois referred to beforehand as the largest strike in American history, which was when 500,000 formerly enslaved Black workers simply walked off their plantations, walked away from the agricultural industry that had exploited them. And I love this part because I actually had a union organizer come up to me a couple of weeks ago, and she was exacerbated, and she wanted to talk about the book, and I was like, oh no, did I misquote something? Did I not cite something? And she just looks at me and she's like, how is it that the first time I've ever thought of enslaved Black people as workers from reading your book? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's someone needs to go to jail. It's true. That's like the fight of CRT, right? To just keep calling us our ancestors slaves as opposed to Black workers who were exploited. So anyway, I digress. But the point is that when we think about what those workers did when they marched off the plantation, it is not dissimilar to the conditions that we are in today. And when we think about the movement that surrounded that period, post the Civil War and radical Reconstruction, what we actually see is a vision for a multiracial democracy that is far beyond a political system. You know, you look at the 13th Amendment that came through radical Reconstruction, which abolished slavery and all forms of forced labor. The 14th Amendment, which started to define citizenship. The 15th Amendment, which started to define who could vote. All of these set the foundation for the promise of democracy and for the fights that we've been as a movement trying to win over the last 150 years around labor. The New Deal came out of it, right? The immigration reform was a reason for it. The Voting Rights Act and all the women's suffrage movement. All of these were trying to build on this promise of a multiracial democracy that came out of the Great Reconstruction, that came out of the worker upsurge of over 500,000 formerly enslaved Black workers walking off the plantation. And so I think my call to us today, as we're thinking about these issues, as we're thinking about this great awakening or great resignation that workers are having today, as we see workers in the streets from Starbucks to Apple to Amazon, as we see auto workers, Southern workers from transplant companies throughout the South, and steel workers and tire factories throughout the South beginning to stand up and say, we aren't going to do this anymore. We need better conditions. We need better pay. It's up to us to not only think about how we're supporting them getting democracy, not just a union contract, but democracy through the framework of expanded organizing, collective bargaining, whatever it needs to look like based on how their employment relationship is organized. But we also need to think about, from a governing perspective, what are the systems? Who among us is the Francis Perkins that's going to set up the new framework for what it might look like to negotiate a contract with Amazon, given the number of unions and organizations that are all supporting workers in different places? Who among us is going to define a new structure, a new infrastructure within the government to mediate discussions between workers and multinational brands? Workers are already in motion. They're already practicing what we need. Now it's up to us to actually build a new framework to finally actualize this multiracial democracy, ideally a democracy we're fighting for. So I will stop there, and I can go on mute and come back on screen. Hopefully I won't freeze again, but thank you, everyone.
Smiley, you're always so awesome. Thank you so much for that. And really briefly, I'll just jump in here. Naomi R Williams, I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, historian of the working class. And my piece in the volume, just briefly, looks at the joint origins of industrial relations and labor history. And coming into industrial relations, employment relations to the field from labor history, for me, it was a bit of a shock, actually, that we do have this common origin story and there's a divergence in what happens there. And it goes directly back to what Maite and Tammy are calling on IR scholars to do. And it's what happened in the late 1980s in the tradition that Danielle is following on, right? So Tara Hunter and Joe Trotter Jr. and David Roediger and Earl Lewis, and so many scholars who said, you know what, we need to ask different questions, we need to ask better questions. And that historical context is really so important to shape how I learn labor history and how I present myself as an activist scholar in the field of labor history. And the reason why I don't call myself a labor historian, but a historian of the working class, is centering the voices of the working people at the putting the voices of working people at the center of my analyses. And in order to understand what's happening, we have to, right, center the workers' voices, and that's central to what's happening here. And I just want to also point out that we have another historian in the volume, Austin McCoy, who does great work on Black industrial workers in the 1970s, and really just broad expanse, right, of everything that Danielle and Smiley were just saying, just beyond what's happening just in the workplace, but what's also happening in the community, in the country, in the world. And for those of you who are interested in the future of work and automation and technological advancement, their analyses in the 1970s about automation and speed ups and what it was doing to Black male workers' bodies who were just now getting into those positions is a really powerful tool to see the value of putting in that historical context to these stories. So I'll pass it so that Maite and Tammy have a chance to talk a bit about some of the other submissions in the journal.
Yeah.
And we have some time for questions too.
Yeah, I'm having a little internet instability, so sorry, someone let me know if I break up. Maite, could you put up the table of contents again? Because I just want to tell everyone about, there was a lot of intentionality in the structure of this volume. And as Sheri mentioned, we wanted to do this volume as an answer to Maite and my call for critical industrial relations. And we wanted to put together a bunch of contributions that would show and make you feel when you read it, what it means to decenter our dominant frames and to sit and be uncomfortable and sit in that pocket of discomfort while other people have the platform for theory building and for explaining what it feels like when you already know that racism is the primary way in which we've organized our systems, right? So when we shift the frames, what do we learn? What questions are you left with as an IR scholar or someone who's reading this volume? And it was very intentional. Obviously, you can see why we asked Danielle and Smiley to contribute, and we're very happy that they did so. But the first part of the book is really about setting that historical and political context. I have a little bit of a discussion in a chapter there where I'm in conversation with another Black scholar, and we do work outside of the United States. So there's sort of an examination of how can critical race theory go outside? What does that mean for our racial constructions? How do we interact in the Caribbean and global South with these concepts? But it was very important also, in addition to folks like Austin McCoy or Danielle or Smiley, that we reorient or we just sort of rethink what we mean by expertise and theory building. And we literally shift to activists and change makers who are on the front lines about how they define capitalism, how they define justice. And you will see that it's inherently tied to issues of work. I know one of the things that Maite and I, as we've tried to build critical race in industrial relations, we run into a lot in our journals. This sort of, why is this a labor question? This seems political, which is, as a Black scholar, I mean, I'm not sure when labor wasn't political, but this idea that we have to grow this understanding of what is a labor problem and who is in the labor movement and what that movement is for and how it's tied to the way in which we're subordinated in these systems, I think is a really important part of the way we've structured the volume. We end, our third part of the volume is really about going into the labor movement itself and having firsthand sort of stories of what it feels like to be a person of color who's trying to lead for change in the labor movement. Some of that is going to be uncomfortable for us to read. I'm pointing here specifically at Javier's piece, which is so personal and so moving. So I hope that this table of contents makes you want to read this volume. I'll say a couple other things about process, and I think we're done. The way we built this is we built teams, cohorts, and everyone was able to do what we call circle work, which is to write their pieces in collaboration with each other, run ideas by each other, in the context of a lot of racial trauma, a war, all sorts of things that were happening to us as workers of color and immigrants and trans people and et cetera, right? And so that really comes out in the way and the style in which people are writing. We finished the volume with a call to action to the field and to academia in particular. We really look forward to how you respond to that. And lastly, I will give a shout out to LERA because we really pushed the envelope with this volume. It's not going to be the way your volume usually reads. From the cover art, which we collaborated with the artist on, right, to the way in which we asked LERA to provide us with money to give contributors who are in marginalized communities who don't get paid for the change-making work that they do, including for us, which we usually expect them to do for free. And so LERA answered that call. We are really happy that LERA did that. And I do want to give a shout out to that. And I guess I will stop talking at 1 on the dot. Maite, moderate us out.
Thanks, Tammy. I wanna,
Oh, we have 15 minutes, sorry.
so
Go
I
ahead.
wanna open it up. Yeah, I wanna open it up for everyone to let's have a broader discussion or conversation, or if there are any questions or comments, or if anyone of the panelists wants to say something as well.
I was going to say, Maite, actually, because I have a tendency to do this, I forgot to actually introduce myself. So my name is Sheri Davis. Professionally, I go by Sheri Davis-Faulkner, and I am Associate Director for the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, as well as Associate Professor of Professional Practice in the School of Management and Labor Relations. So I have a bad habit of not doing that, but I wanted to make sure I at least said who I was.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sheri. So any further comments or questions, or also things from the comments from the panelists? I think Joel. Did we just lose him?
No, Joel, you need to.
No, I just had to
unmute
turn my
your-
microphone off. I'm sorry.
Okay.
As a white boy from the suburbs who's committed to being an ally, I really want to lift up just how much learning we can all do from what you're sharing with this. And if it's okay, I'd like to share a tiny historical footnote and then ask a question of you. The tiny footnote is that in 1963, my father was asked to do a study on unemployment in the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I think it was one of the first studies of structural racism in a labor market, in which at that time, the census did not, and the Department of Labor didn't count employment by race. So a group of Black citizens in the 7th Ward of Lancaster went door to door, and they calculated that the white unemployment rate was at full employment, right around 3%, and the Black unemployment rate was at 12.6%. And of course, the question for the research was why? And of course, the answer was the bus routes didn't go from the 7th Ward to where the jobs were. The school counselors did not advise the Black students to go to college. There were any number of things that were documented. But what I really want to highlight is my dad didn't really call this into question at the time, but in retrospect, it was an intersectional finding, because the majority of the unemployed were Black women over the age of 40. And so it was a story of race, a story of gender, and a story of age. And we've now reconnected with people in the 7th Ward 60 years later, where there still is a race gap on unemployment in the city of Lancaster, even though there have been many efforts to address things over the 6 decades. And we're going to revisit, redo the survey to understand what I would call the persistence of structural barriers in labor markets. And so I'd be delighted to talk with anyone about that, but it's a tiny historical footnote. But it was just eye-opening seeing what we knew then. And many of the people who were interviewed in the study are still alive and sharing their lived experiences. But here's the question that I'd like to ask all of you, and it's sort of an organizing question. And I say this with caution because I take to heart the words from the disability community of nothing about us without us. And so we do have in LERA a set of interest sections and industry councils. And as I look at the program, there's quite a lot of content on DEI, on racial disparities and other issues, but there is no interest section in LERA centered on that. And I wouldn't presume to know what to call it, but I'm wondering whether your work on the volume sets the stage for a continuing community of practice within LERA to continue and expand the conversation. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's very important. And one of the things that we knew we weren't going to be able to do was everything. But we do call for, one, we acknowledge the fact that this is not exhaustive, nor is it representative. It's merely meant to open the door. And then basically to make the argument that we should continue along this pathway and broaden, because it will actually, as we signal that this is a place to do this work, that I do think that we will hear and see in more work in that way that is speaking to the many exclusions, right? Like that's the thing about, why whiteness as property is so important, because it helps us to understand that the system of whiteness is based on this idea of the right to exclude, and that those exclusionary practices and policies that have been in place for a long time are the very things that we're trying to work against. And inclusion does not actually repair those harms. We actually have to disrupt and shift the way that we do this work. And that we're asking for, calling for, begging for, quite frankly, this to be the way that we move.
That's very exciting. Tamara?
I'll just add, Joel, and Maite and I have a paper kind of on this, hopefully coming out, where we talk about what are the components of intersectional organizing. And in some ways, putting together this volume was an organizing thing. And one of the things that we're saying is that inclusion or intersectionality is not an end game or a numbers game. It's a process, right? And so that means you have to be open to being called in on this really valuable narrative is missing. No one is excluded, including white folks, including men. Everyone's being called in. So I think it would be an amazing institutional response to us raising the question and pulling up critical race theory to say what we need is to have a committee that focuses on disability as an intersection and be explicit about it and make sure that even within disability, that's all of us, now or later, right? So I think that it's not about what's missing, it's about who else do we need to center to make sure we understand the full class by understanding the most marginalized. So I welcome that as an institutional and a field response.
And if I could, however this emerges, under whatever banner it emerges, on the one hand, there is room among the interest sections for something like this to be part of LERA. And, we just had a meeting of the leadership of the group, and one of the recommendations was to encourage along these lines. But I also want to say that the way in which this happens will probably change what we think about as interest sections. And so I want to encourage you to push at the boundaries so that, because the way we do things may not be the right way to do things. And, I appreciate that in producing this volume, you worked in a collaborative mode that was not the normal, each person stay in their chimney and write their chapter. And so I'm looking forward to learning what emerges from how to have an interest section or set of sections that is intersectional, that is lifting up BIPOC work and others in ways that has a home in LERA and that helps to change LERA.
Thanks for that, Joel, and thanks for also bringing up that research that was done and your question.
I just wanted to add briefly, just adding to the great points that Tammy and Sheri made, is that intersectionality and critical race theory is an analysis of power. And so, as Tammy brought up, it is a call for everyone to come in, right? And so by centering critical race theory and intersectionality, that inherently includes everyone, because as we know, power is relational. So this really is a call. I think I see the volume as a call for everyone to take up an intersectional analysis. So in a critical race theoretical analysis, so that the onus isn't always on people of color to be inclusive, right? Where, people of color are always not just the one group who's called on to be inclusive. So I just wanted to add that in terms of the power and actually the radical potential and call for that intersectionality and critical race theory calls for. So it's something for all of us.
Yeah, that power should get activated too, Joel, et al. Like in this volume, we have asked people from who are, non-binary, who are asexual, who have a huge number of identities to educate us on certain aspects that we overlook all the time when we collapse the working class into a predominantly class construction, right? When we ask people to share that information and to guide us, part of the power shift is that we actually engage and collaborate with them in the building of what's the new institution, what are the new structures. It's not a plantation mentality where we're the ones who know everything and we decide how these intersections go. We should be in collaboration. Part of that conversation is why we invited practitioners in the field who are on the front lines of what it means to do intersectional organizing to be in conversation with us and for us to actually share decision-making about what the field is, what are our questions of the day, how should we organize an academic conference, right? And Joel, in that exec board meeting that we had, right, there was a tremendous discussion about how do we grow practitioner participation in the LERA conference, which was followed by the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Those things need to be in conversation and they cannot be separated if we're really about that life, if we're really about justice, if we're really about making this better, right? Which is what really the whole project is about. Sheri mentioned interest convergence, which is, it's talked about in the negative, right? We only make big transformative change when we overlap with the interests of the dominant group, right? But one of the things that we're offering here is interest convergence. This will make LERA better. This will make IR better. It's not about bringing down what we've done in the past or attacking worthy scholars traditionally. It's about how can we be more contemporary and relevant about where the expertise lies and how we build. And I think we just have to model that now.
Well, and I appreciate that those who experience the harshest disparities shouldn't be made to do all the work to educate everybody else, that we all have a duty to be part of the learning and the process. And that's why I framed it with caution, because on the one hand, it seems limiting to say these issues are only in an intersection because they cut across everything that we do. Yeah. At the same time, if they don't have a visible home in LERA, it dissipates. And so I really want to encourage you collectively to shape this in a way that it becomes, in a sense, both a visible center within the structure, which is what the intersections do. At the same time, it's not limited to that.
Yeah, I just want to say, one of the things that I say at the end of my chapter really is going back to Mari Matsuda's work, which I identify as a blueprint. And one of the things that she talks about is that it does matter that in these moments where within academia, we defer to the systems that have existed beforehand as it relates to pathways to tenure or what have you. And we use the same criteria that has been exclusionary in the past to be able to judge folks who are calling for something different, that is something that we actually have to confront. That it matters for me to be able to recruit students that I engage at Spelman to come to a Rutgers, that I need to be able to say to them, what you just experienced at Spelman, you will be able to find scholars who are also going to be able to engage this conversation with you, as opposed to them feeling like they have to shed what they came up with. I mean, I was exposed to intersectionality senior year of my college experience, and I've kind of had that approach through all of my, my master's and my doctorate. I've had that support and I come up through Black feminist frameworks. That's how I come to labor. But asking people to shed all that, to be able to step into a space that doesn't engage with these other texts, doesn't engage with these bodies of literature, doesn't engage with these ways of thinking, these methodologies or what have you, I can't recruit people under those circumstances if I don't know that they're going to be able to come and get access to the kinds of classes that will allow them to ask the questions that we need them to ask. Like, we have to understand that higher education was also exclusionary, and that until we diversify the people who are inside the academy asking the questions and the perspectives that they're bringing, that is actually part of the work, like that we should be creating pathways for amazing worker leaders. I've had more worker leaders talk to me about potentially getting their master's or their doctorate at this point, but some of these folks could teach it. And so they're talking about coming in to do this thing. And I feel like if we're not able to have something expansive for them to be able to really bring all of who they are and what they've done into the space, we're going to be losing. They're going to go to another discipline. They're going to go to another place where it feels like there's a space for them, where it's meant for them. And that is some of the work that we internally have to be doing to say to them, this is a home for you to be able to develop, expand, and move push our movements forward internally within academia, but also building our movements.
So I see, Naomi, you have your hand up, and then we'll have to check on time.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump in, and Sheri said a bunch of what I was going to say, so I'll skip all of that and link back to the session that was on just before us with the PhD students from Rutgers and point to it as an example of people attempting to do this work, right, but in very precarious positions. So as PhD students in the field of IR, doing this work, like, where is it going to go? And seeing Maite and Tammy and their struggles to get their work published, right, in the journals of the field, and yet at the same time, right, creating all of this interest and all of these ideas of, oh, how do we ask different questions? How do we do new work? How do we integrate this, right? It really calls on people who are the gatekeepers to open the doors and to signal to early career scholars that there's going to be a path for them to do that. And so that's another one of our calls to action in the volume, and the examples too that so many of the practitioners talk about their struggles to gain entry into certain things or to find a place to do the work, right? We can answer those questions, and now's the time to answer those questions.
Thanks for that, Naomi. Given that we're kind of over time, I just wanted to check before we get out of the session. Smiley or Danielle, is there any final comments that you all have?
I was waiting for Danielle to jump in. Not really. I mean, it's been a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate the thoroughness with which the authors of the volume have kind of thought about pulling this together and the different pieces, the questions that it sparks. I think if anything, I just want to continue holding the big picture of where we're trying to go and why it is important both contextually or to contextualize the work of labor historians with the moment that's happening now in the world and how important it is. I think it'll be a big misstep to not, I think Danielle said it probably best, so I won't try to repeat it because it won't be as good, but it would be a misstep, not just in, again, what's morally right and what's historically accurate, but it would be a miscalculation of power to not look at things at these intersections. And it could very easily doom us to make mistakes that we don't have to make moving forward. So just thanking everyone for the opportunity to have this platform to talk about these issues, and frankly, to sit here and listen to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Smiley. And again, I would recommend everyone to get Smiley's book that is just out. And thank you as well for contributing to this volume. Danielle?
I'll just be really brief. I think Smiley summed it up well. I'm just really excited for the volume to come out, and I'm really interested in even hearing the conversations that people will have after reading the volume. Just as we were, as Smiley was talking earlier in terms of the Amazon strikes in New York versus Bessemer, Alabama. I was thinking how the particular centering of critical race theory in this volume presents even more questions about the strike and what happened in Bessemer versus New York. Because when looking at how people voted in favor or not in favor of a union in Bessemer, it was divided along racial lines in many ways. So there's a lot of conversations that I think are going to come out of it in terms of also the particulars of labor organizing and race in the South. So I'm really excited about that. But thanks so much, Naomi, Sheri, Tammy, and Maite for all of the wonderful work that you've done and are doing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Danielle, for being on the volume, for contributing. And thank you to the audience for being in this session with us and communicating through your chats. So yeah, thanks for being here. And we look forward for the volume to be out and continue this work and these conversations. Thank you.